OK. So with application level denial of service out of the way, now we can move to network level denial of service. And we're still doing denial of service attacks where we're trying to overwhelm resources. But now, instead of targeting the code that's running on the server somewhere, we're instead going to target the network underneath. So now we're going to notice that networks themselves have a limited amount of resources. And we'll try to overwhelm those to break internet access to the server. So if we somehow overwhelm the network, then people have no way to send and receive packets to the server, and we've taken down service. This is different from crashing the server or overwhelming the server itself. We're overwhelming the network underneath. So here are some examples of how you might do that. You could try and overwhelm the amount of bandwidth available on the network. So remember that bandwidth is the amount of data you can upload or download per unit time. So for example, if the server has an internet connection that only supports 10 megabits per second, or megabytes per second, then the attacker could try and send 20 megabytes per second, and that would cause the server to be overwhelmed, and it would not have enough bandwidth to support legitimate requests from other users. Or sometimes networks have limited packet processing capacity, which means that a router or a server is only able to process a certain number of packets per second because it has to unwrap those headers, forward the packet, and otherwise process that packet. So maybe if a router or a server is limited to processing 10 packets per second, then the attacker can try and send 20 packets per second, and that might be a way to overwhelm the packet processing capacity at some specific router. So these are some possible ways you can overwhelm the network for taking down a server. Now, all this time we've been talking about denial of service attacks, but if you go into the real world and read news articles, maybe you see DDoS instead. So their acronym seems to have an extra D in front. What does it stand for? It stands for distributed denial of service. And here the difference is that instead of one attacker targeting a server, we'll have a whole bunch of attackers all trying to overwhelm the same server. So in all of our attacks so far, we've just been thinking about one attacker going after a server. But distributed attacks involve a whole bunch of attackers, or maybe a whole bunch of computers operated by the same attacker, all targeting the same server. So it's many people attacking one victim. So why are DDoS attacks so powerful? Why do they always show up in the news? Well, they give the attacker a lot of advantages. One advantage is that the attacker has an enormous amount of resources that they can use. They control all of these different computers, so they might have way more bandwidth that they can use to attack the server compared to an attacker just using their own computer. So they have a big bandwidth advantage here. Also, if there are so many different attackers, now the server is going to have a very hard time distinguishing what traffic is normal and what traffic is part of the DDoS attack. So if there was just one attacker, maybe you would notice that there's one attacker, and you could block them, and maybe that would stop the attack. But if there's so many different attackers, then you have to somehow identify that these are the attackers, and these are not the attackers, and that can be really hard. There's actually a term for a lot of computers under the control of one attacker. It's called a botnet. And the idea is that the attacker uses some sort of vulnerability, like a buffer overflow, to compromise a whole bunch of computers. And now that all the computers are controlled by the attacker can force all of them to flood a specific target server in the hopes of taking that server down.